We really have to let Bernie get out of the sun.
Don't melt on us, Bernie. Get back inside.
I'll try.
Hey guys.
Hello.
Hey there.
Now, we had planned this week, hadn't we, to talk a bit about the US military given the big parade in Washington, D.C. to mark the 250th anniversary of the US Army and the 79th birthday of President Donald Trump as well. That is happening in the city here. But I mean, we didn't know that the US military was going to become so front and center to the news this week with the deployment of the National Guard to California, to Texas, the deployment of US Marines to California as well. We've been talking a lot about the US military. So I think it's probably worthwhile taking a step back and having a look at, if we want to call them Trump's troops, and how the president and this administration is really shaping the US military and the various changes that they've made and kind of what we've seen over the last few months. But if we just start maybe for our non-American viewers and listeners to explain the difference in this country anyway between when we're talking about the National Guard and then when we're talking about other branches of the US military, like the Army, like the Marines.
Well, I think it's quite different than most other countries do it, in that the National Guard in the United States is kind of run at a state level, and the governor can call up those forces. Usually it's done for kind of disaster response. We saw that in Hurricane Katrina, for example. We've seen that after earthquakes and hurricanes more recently as well. Some of those units can be federalized by the federal government, which is exactly what happened in California during the recent unrest, as opposed to active duty troops who are kind of full-time members of the U.S. military. They hold no other job. An example of that would be 27, that's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in California, which is an active duty unit permanently assigned to the U.S. military with no other function than to be an infantry unit, was sent to help the federal efforts in California as well. And then there's a separate reserve component of each of the service branches in which there's kind of a small commitment if you're in it, a weekend every month, a longer training period every now and then, but you could be called up to active service. So those are three kind of very distinct kind of setups in the broader U.S. military.
And you really have seen those lines come together, haven't we? I mean, there was a question of whether the controversy of the deployment of the National Guard, the federalizing of the National Guard being sent to Los Angeles, and those active duty Marines as well, whether that would overshadow kind of what's been otherwise seen as a big celebration of the Army and its history. And as the Army says, U.S. history, the Army's history mirroring so much of U.S. history as well over the last 250 years. But, I find it really interesting, to your point, Bernie, with the National Guard troops. Governor Gavin Newsom has said, look, our National Guard troops are already deployed in other capacities. For example, they're doing forest management because of California's propensity for wildfires. So literally, brushing through forests to make sure that they're prepared for fire season. And he's also made the point that these are National Guard troops that do otherwise have full-time jobs, right? And so some of them serve in law enforcement. Whereas the Marines who are being brought into the situation in Los Angeles, as you said, are active duty military. And I found it really interesting. I spoke to, we know Democrats have been extremely critical of this decision, not just California Democrats across the country, saying that it's a politicization of the military and also the federal government stomping on California's state rights. But I found it interesting that one of the California delegation congressmen who I spoke to earlier this week, a Democrat, had said, look, I don't think it's necessarily a bad decision for the National Guard to be involved here. It's just the way it was done. And perhaps the governor, Gavin Newsom, should have taken control, or should still take control of those troops, so that it's no longer in the hands of the president. And that just goes to Bernie's explanation at the beginning there, that this is a state troops, essentially, that are usually working on behalf of the state for, as we said, wildfires, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. And if they are brought back into the control of the governor's purview, that would benefit his hand here against the president.
I mean, that's been the big point of discussion all week, hasn't it? It's not really that the National Guard are there because in a way they have a very limited role. They can really just defend the federal buildings, the detention centre, the ICE agents. It's not that they are out in the middle of protesters on highways and so on. But the difference between what they're doing in California and in Texas is that it was President Trump who sent them into California, whereas in Texas it was Governor Abbott himself who kind of signed off on their involvement there, because as we've been saying, it's state-led, and that's what's caused so much of the discussion point here. And in many ways it feels like it's a face-off between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom, doesn't it? More so than it's been about the protests in Los Angeles, which have had some very hot moments and some flare-ups, but compared to what we've seen in this country in the past decade around some of the protests to do around Black Lives Matter, things we've seen in Ferguson and Baltimore over the years, it feels like it's been a lot smaller and a lot more contained than that.
I certainly think the optics of it are very different than what we saw in 2020. I mean, you guys will remember the pictures, for example, of National Guardsmen on the steps of the monuments in Washington, D.C., or of military helicopters flying over Black Lives Matter Plaza. It certainly didn't feel like that, but I think from both sides, the optics of this were interesting, and that some officials in California are saying this really wasn't necessary to deploy active duty Marines and the National Guard, for example. But at the same time, the administration is very clear that they see it as kind of necessary, and they want to project that image of strength and security, which I think kind of falls broadly in line with the image they want to portray of the Department of Defense more generally.
Yeah, and I think, it's also really raised a question for me as I've been watching the debate over the use of the military, of how the military can or should not be politicized. And I saw that really on full display when President Trump delivered an address at Fort Bragg to the 82nd Airborne Division. And in that speech, he, as he often does when he's on stage, delivered plenty of political broadsides, sharp attacks on his opponents, but he was criticized for whipping up fervor among the troops, the soldiers who were on hand there.
Generations of Army heroes did not shed their blood on distant shores only to watch
and he's standing on screen, and you see them standing all behind him. You heard plenty of cheers for when President Trump was criticizing his predecessor, also Commander-in-Chief, President Biden, but also the California governor, Gavin Newsom. And that it's important to note, that in the U.S., the military, they take an oath to the Constitution, and the standard, what is expected of soldiers in this country, is that they show no political leanings. Of course, they might have their personal political leanings, but that has no place in their role. And there they were, of course, seated behind the president, expressing political opinion. And there was, one report by military.com, which is a website that covers military news, said that they reviewed internal messaging at the 82nd Airborne Division and said that there had been some screening that took place beforehand. That in one internal memo, it had said, on appearance, no fat soldiers behind the president, so that there was a certain appearance behind him. And also that anybody who opposed the president's agenda should be asked to be moved to another part of the display, essentially. We haven't verified that ourselves, but it just goes to show you that this has been a real question of, is the military itself being politicized, particularly in this administration?
I mean, senior people in the military, present and past, would say that they swear an oath to America, to the Constitution, to the citizens of America, and the president is the commander-in-chief, but that they don't do things that aren't, in line with kind of what the Constitution says, what, American citizens need. And I guess we saw that actually in the confirmation hearings in the Senate for Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, didn't we? When he was questioned by many senators about what would he do if President Trump asked him to use American troops for things that were not in line with the Constitution and, were kind of against normal practice. And he was asked that several times and he really didn't answer it, sort of said, well, the president would never ask me to do something that isn't in line with tradition or correct or whatever. But it was one of those niggly points that a lot of Democratic senators in particular pointed to at that time, because we don't hear a lot from Secretary Hegseth really you know, in a press conference format or anything other than him doing, he does interviews on Fox News as all of the members of the administration does, but he does these little pre-taped videos himself. But we're not seeing like big Pentagon briefings in the same way as we maybe would have in the past, or the Secretary of Defense doing the Sunday morning shows on all of the networks, not just Fox News.
And I think it's not just the Secretary of Defense. I mean, towards the end of the Biden administration, and I guess the very beginning of this administration, we saw the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, kind of, without saying Trump's name, very explicitly say that the U.S. military doesn't serve quote unquote wannabe dictators. I think you saw that politicization kind of from both sides, which I think kind of came to the forefront during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. And we're seeing kind of an extension of that. But certainly this administration is very clear and very explicit in that they want to be seen as the most pro-military administration in U.S. history, both in terms of funding, in terms of kind of the mindset of the military. They really want to, their words are, they want to kind of take any sort of handcuffs off the military in terms of operating the way it wants to and thinks it needs to. So I think it really is becoming very politicized. And I don't think that's necessarily unpopular among the rank and file of the military, I think it should be said.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting to note that we have actually seen Pete Hegseth testifying on Capitol Hill in various committees this week, and I was watching a pretty, you know, heated exchange in the House Armed Services Committee among Democrat members who themselves are veterans, as Pete Hegseth is, as the Secretary of Defense is, particularly on this question of some of the changes that have been made at the Department of Defense on slashing quote unquote woke programs. So. You know, they were questioning him on the ethos of the military in making sure that everyone feels included. And he said, no, unity is our priority, not diversity is our strength. And it just kind of goes to underline the Trump administration's new approach to the military. And interesting, you know, in some of the cuts that we've seen at the Department of Defense, they have said that they want to cut $50 billion each year from the budget. And that would essentially mean, you know, pretty significant cuts. If you look at what DOGE had reached at the Pentagon, there were around $6 billion in cuts. We understand that's what the Secretary of Defense said. But we also saw him announce that among active duty military, about 20% of four-star generals would be shed from the force. And that's particularly interesting because what you said, Bernie, about rank and file, the criticism of cutting these active four-star generals is that they are the ones who understand that oath and duty to the Constitution. And by shedding those generals, that perhaps you do achieve more of a politicization of that rank and file.
And I think it's interesting also in that there's a perception in the administration that the military's always been very top heavy. And some of the people at the top, they blame for example, the withdrawal from Kabul in 2021, which being so chaotic. They blame kind of the senior leadership of the Pentagon at the time, in addition to the Biden administration, as being largely responsible for that. So I think, you know, their mindset is that by kind of shedding that top half, it makes the military a more efficient machine geared to doing what it's supposed to do, which is fight American wars. I mean, that's what the Trump administration will tell you. But I think, you know, the black eye that, for example, the Afghan withdrawal left the United States is something that's felt very deeply by President Trump. He brings it up all the time. I mean, I was just in an event with him about an hour ago. He brought it up completely unprompted to a question that had nothing to do with it. And that happens quite often. So I think, you know, that kind of impact, you're seeing it in kind of reflected in the way they deal with the Pentagon.
And when you're talking about funding, I mean, the budget for the Department of Defense is, you know, this administration is aiming for $1 trillion. So when you're talking about cuts of $6 billion, you know, that's so tiny in the grand scheme of $1 trillion. But I was speaking to Steve Bannon earlier in the week, and as we know, not a great friend of Elon Musk.
His citizenship is false. And if you're going to,
do you have evidence yourself of that?
Well, evidence has been out there from his brother all over the place. There's been a number of media reports.
But he was so critical of what he would call the so-called work that DOGE did in those few months. Particularly, he singled out to me the Defense Department because, you know, as you're saying, Sumi, this administration and Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, all of the people who are so close to the president and so kind of allied with his policies and positions, see the DOD as being very, very like a bottomless pit of money. But at the same time, they're spending so much on it, and they talk about an American military that is not as strong as it should be, you know, across all branches. Like ships aren't being built here, and the Navy are crying out for new ships. Like a lot of the equipment needs a re-up. We saw earlier in the year, didn't we, the president with Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan talking about new aircraft, fighter jets going into Michigan. We've heard them talking about this Golden Dome air defense, space defense system, and all of the money that they want to put into that. But trying to keep that within their spending goals, they have to make more significant cuts, as Steve Bannon was saying and many others would say, than what has currently been slated. And Pete Hegseth got a lot of heat over that this week of, you know, his budget and his funding. It's baking in the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill and the cuts that are contained in that. And of course, there is a massive if attached to that Big Beautiful Bill when we talk about if it passes.
And it presents a really difficult balancing act for the president in that he repeats the words, you know, peace through strength quite regularly. And that's quite expensive given America's kind of security concerns, whether they be at the border or in the Middle East or trying to stay competitive with China, Russia. You know, there's always the concern of North Korea, for example. That's all enormously expensive to kind of project that power abroad. So I think they're very kind of limited in what they can do budget-wise on a downward scale, and, you know, given the demands on the military.
I mean, it's important to note that the Pentagon failed, you know, several audits in a row. So the efforts to try to bring that DoD budget under control, that is not necessarily a controversial thing among Democrats and Republicans. I think what's going to be more difficult, if you look at the efforts to cut around 8% of the budget a year, as I said, around $50 million a year, that comes at the same time, as you've been saying, there are demands on the budget to grow certain parts of the military. We know that, you know, the president wants to see a surge of military assistance to the southern border. And that, you know, will add an extra strain. And simply on next generation military technology, on drones, on you know, submarines and shipbuilding, as you said, Katrina. So where the money will come from while they're adding to the budget is going to be obviously a real challenge.
There has been as well a change in the ethos in the military. I mean, we hear President and Secretary Hegseth talking often about how they've seen a recruitment bump to people wanting to join the US military since the election in November, and more so since the inauguration. But at the same time, Pete Hegseth has been really powering along the removal of certain policies, like the DEI policies, obviously, which are gone right across the administration. But obviously also, as we've seen recently, the renaming of ships, the renaming of some bases. You know, many people will be familiar with Harvey Milk, the gay rights campaigner, very famous movie made about him. Pete Hegseth has ordered the Navy to rename the ship that's called in his honor. Many other, they want to bring back some of the Confederate leaders and the bases that are named after them as well. So there's a lot going on right across the military space, isn't there, in terms of trying to kind of change it. Members of the trans community as well, changing the entry requirements for women versus men. And it just comes back to what they see as the strength of the military and how they can change it and how they can shape it to be more the way they want it to be.
It's actually been really fascinating to see how that kind of plays out, and that Hegseth kind of repeatedly says that the military needs to be kind of more lethal. There needs to be a bigger, greater war fighting ethos in his terms, which I think is quite, from what I understand, quite popular in the military. But at the same time, I think it's a bit of a stretch in that the administration links that to recruitment, which is higher than it has been in quite some time. But we started to see it kind of climb up before Trump became president, actually towards the tail end of Biden. I think, you know, they're comparing it to the pandemic slump, which really was kind of a recruitment issue for the US military. And it's quite difficult for them to say that because every year the DoD changes its recruitment targets on a needs basis annually. So it's really hard to compare. This year is more successful than any other year. I think that's if one looks at the numbers, that's kind of a stretch to say that those two things are linked: the warfighting ethos and the recruitment. But it's one the administration is very happy to make.
But it's seen as a great job, though, as well, isn't it? Like, particularly in certain communities where there's a long tradition, multi-generations in various branches, it's a solid job. It's got a good pay scale. You can get your college degree. How many people in this country have got their college degrees through the military? There's housing. But then on the flip side of it, you see that veterans are not treated fantastically by successive administrations, and there's been much complaints as well, hasn't there, about some of the veteran schemes that have been cut by this administration, that people give so much for this country and then oftentimes they're just forgotten about. And you can see that as you walk around the big cities of this country, and in many members of the homeless community are veterans.
I saw that point made in an online forum that the Army is boasting a recruitment bump, but in 20, 30 years with the cuts to the Veterans Affairs Administration, that they perhaps won't be served in the way that they need to be. But it's interesting to see the Secretary of the Army, Daniel Driscoll, talking about how the Army parade for the 250th anniversary of the Army, that they see this as a real opportunity to recruit massive numbers of young Americans, young men and women. They think that with the Army, quote unquote, parading in its full glory with the equipment and the strength and warrior ethos, as you were just saying, that will inspire many young Americans to join the military. Of course, to Bernie's point, the numbers we just don't have on hand just yet. And we'll, of course, have to see if there is a big boost, and also whether that bump after President Trump was elected, whether that does play out in the numbers, or whether it's kind of over a longer period of time, the ups and downs pre and post pandemic. But it is a different messaging, isn't it, from the previous administrations? And you see the change in how the military is talked about, and also what the imagery is that they want to feature for the military.
Well, when you look at images of tanks, troops marching, aircraft being trailed along the National Mall, that is very powerful imagery. We've seen that in other countries. It's a projection of strength. Look at all the toys that I have. Look at all the people that I have. And we know when President Trump in his first administration went to Paris to meet the French President Emmanuel Macron for the first time and watched a similar parade on Bastille Day along the Champs-Élysées. I mean, he still talks about that, doesn't he, to this day, all these years later, about how, fantastic it was. And he's been speaking about it since then, that he wanted to see the same thing in Washington, D.C. And here we are. Just happens to be his 79th birthday as well.
And, I think the one thing we've heard from him repeatedly now is that he's seen it not only in France, but in other countries, in Russia, in Mexico, for example, in India, the countries that do an annual military parade. He sees that as them celebrating those countries' kind of history and success. And that's very much what he wants to see in the United States. Just at that event I was at earlier, he said, he was asked, what do you hope people get out of it? That this country is great. And, I think for a lot of his base in particular, who felt that under Biden things weren't going particularly well, I think that message really resonates with his base, many of whom felt in the past that things weren't going well under the Biden administration, for example.
You left North Korea out of your list there, Bernie, of countries that hold military parades.
And China, yeah.
Indeed. Well, I think we're out of time, and we really have to let Bernie get out of the sun. Otherwise, I'm concerned he's going to melt
away on us. Don't melt on us, Bernie.
I'll try.
See you. Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then please do like or subscribe. And we love to hear from you. So please leave a comment below, or you can email us at path@bbc.co.uk.